And good morning all. I'd like to acknowledge, as a Koori man from northwest New South Wales, Gamilaroi country, that I'm on the land of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge elders past and present. And say what a fabulous gathering this is. This is the second one we've done. We did one in Sydney as well. This one's bigger and better, which I suppose is the Melbourne way, really, isn't it? Okay, so Dave and I have been given 20 minutes, and if you know Dave and I, that's a challenge. So we're going to do the very truncated version. I have more questions at the end, I guess. Can I say this is actually bouncing off, but when Chelsea got her OLT, Officer Learning and Teaching Fellowship, I also got a fellowship from the OLT. And it's incredible, isn't it, how our two fellowships have paralleled and talked to each other and sort of charted similar waters. And so I'll bring some of those findings from the work that Dave and I and other colleagues here in Australia, in Aotearoa and in Canada, have done around this similar work with a slightly different twist, we hope. So see, putting his reading glasses on. The short title of the work we're doing is, it's around resistance, and it's around how we can work with resistance rather than beat our heads against this resistance. And one of the weapons we've found we've weaponised our approach. One of the things we've found which really helps is to actually take apart the racism we're talking about in a cognitive way, to enable the students to actually grapple with it, because the emotion's always there, it's always there. But if we find cognitive strategies to deal with it, or to start that conversation going, things seem to shift. So we've called today's Deconstructing Racism, and looking both transformation individually, but also crucially organisationally. So see if I can fly this. And acknowledging that it's from the OLT, this work has been supported over quite some time now. I'm very slow in getting my report back. This is the starting point. If we're doing the cultural safety training that we're often employed to do, it unsettles people. The starting point is dissonance. And should I explain, I'm a card-carrying psychologist, but it's just dawned on me in the last year or so that, in fact, behind resistance is actually dissonance. Because when we're bringing the narratives, the stats of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, or the insights and the self-reflective gaze for a change of cultural safety, we unsettle people with fresh information that jars with everything they've ever learnt about their country, themselves, their belief structure. And people sometimes feel the rug is being pulled out from underneath them. And so there's the genesis of some of that resistance. If we can find ways to deal with that dissonance, we're getting somewhere. But it does start with discomfort. It's not an easy ride. So how can we actually do this transformative learning without doing the transformative unlearning first? I've got 5 minutes and I'll bring on my colleague and then I'll round up with an extra 5 minutes. So Dave, in fact, helped me to get my head around one way we make this disquiet manageable. It's not about not making people uncomfortable. This stuff just generates discomfort. But how can we keep them in the room? How can we make the disquiet manageable enough for learning to take place? And Dave actually said, he said, when I was down at Camp Coorong, and I'm speaking for you now, Dave, the mouth of the River Murray. I've been in Adelaide 9 years now, so I can say the River Murray, not the Murray River. He said, Uncle Tom and others there held me very gently through my journey as a white fella. And that's got me thinking about how we deal with this response spectrum we now know exists. This is from our work at Flinders, but our colleagues at SANYES, Indigenous Cultural Safety Training in British Columbia, have found exactly the same spectrum of response from practicing health professionals in British Columbia. And they've taken 30,000 of them through their sophisticated online cultural safety training and found exactly the same pattern. That at one end get people who are ready to go, who are truth tellers, change agents. At the other end, you get people who are sometimes overtly hostile to your face, in class, on the back channels, social media, behind your teaching, and there are two large lumpy groups in between who are struggling. And so we think, what can we do to actually work with these differential groupings of response, of resistance? I'll flash through this. No, I'll give you one more here. To say that we need mechanisms, we need strategies that engage people at all levels along that spectrum. And Dave will talk about one particular strategy you've hit upon now for individual change, and at the very end I'll talk a little bit about institutional change if we've got some time.
Thank you, Uncle. I would like to acknowledge that I'm here on Wurundjeri country. I want to acknowledge that also that this country has never been ceded by treaty. I want to also acknowledge, and I think this is part of what I do in my teaching with my students, particularly as a non-Indigenous person, I want to acknowledge my white privilege. I want to acknowledge that that privilege is going to continue. It will benefit my children. It will benefit my children's children. And sometimes when I'm teaching with a group of non-Indigenous students, they'll come up to me afterwards and say, oh, you know, that was a bit over the top, Dave, or that was a bit much. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm not necessarily trying to overwhelm them, but I want to take them into a place of cognitive dissonance where they feel a little bit uncomfortable, because these are conversations that are difficult. And I like the way Chelsea talked about dealing with white talk. If it's always gently done, if it's always, I suppose, obfuscating the most difficult aspects of the conversation, well, then the conversation is ineffective. Over my time at Camp Coorong, which is a race relations and cultural education centre down south of Adelaide, I was very fortunate to be in relationship with the Ngarrindjeri community, where people like Uncle Tom Trevorrow would say to me, yeah, well, that's okay, Dave, yeah, what you said there, that I like that. He said, but, you know, that's coming from your perspective as a white fella. He says, as Ngarrindjeri, we talk about it like this. And so he was constantly introducing nuances about language and things that I would say unwittingly as a white fella that come from privilege and come from only knowing one world. I was taught artfully over probably a decade or so, and I'm sure that process will continue until I die, of being able to traverse the worlds in which people want to engage in. Often our students want to know, I teach in health sciences, so often our students want to know about what is wrong with Aboriginal people. How do I treat an Aboriginal person with diabetes or cardiovascular health, or, you know, chronic conditions? And we'll look at that very narrow view of what their role might be, and how do I work with this, you know, problem. And one of our issues is to try to take that language and get them to realise what they're saying, get them to realise it's not actually about you knowing about Aboriginal people, it's about knowing what you bring to that clinical health encounter and whether or not that's going to enable it to be a culturally safe space. I was teaching at Flinders University. I hadn't been there very long when a student piped up in a class when I was teaching at Yungarandi there with Faye Blanche. And a student piped up in a tutorial and she said, well, if we come from Adam and Eve, where did black people come from? And there were similar noises across the room, and there was guffaws, and I was thinking, wow, you know, been here 3 weeks and now I've got to work. Like at camp, you had time. You had people for 2 or 3 days to run a program, and they had a whole input of people, and, you know, I felt like this was going to be interesting to manage. And so I spoke to, you know, I had to manage that class and make sure that everyone came out alive. And I was speaking to my wife about, I said, you know, there's got to be a pretty significant percentage of white fellas in that classroom who are wondering the same thing, but just hadn't asked it. And I said, I want to get these questions out there. These are the ugly questions, the awkward questions, the colonial discursive practice that we need to be able to unpack in order to address racism. And so Annette suggested, what about anonymous questions? People will ask anything if they don't have to put their name to it. And so we started doing that, and I've built up hundreds and hundreds of those questions over the years. And so there's a little bit of description as to what these questions are about. I know I've got a very brief time, so I'm going to skip through. I want to acknowledge Ngarrindjeri uncles and aunties. I've got there the Ngoris. They've more recently been called pelicans. But I've got there the Ngoris on the Coorong, on Ngarrindjeri Rui, and they represent Uncle Tom's Ngachi, his spiritual totem. And it was his gift. This is work that has come from the Ngarrindjeri community. This is a way of bringing black epistemologies into the academy, of acknowledging methods of dealing with racism that haven't been thought up by a non-Indigenous academic from a non-Indigenous perspective. They've come through relationship, and they've proven quite effective. And so I wanted to acknowledge those uncles and aunties, and there's a brief example of some of the Ngarrindjeri community there and their leaders. So I apologise for the offensive nature of these questions, but I thought I'd better dive right in. These are the sorts of questions that I get asked in the anonymous questions. And because I've been collecting them since 2007, I've hundreds of them, and I've gleaned down to about 5 at the moment that I think really give the students the opportunity to come almost indirectly to be able to turn that white gaze, which they are happily training on Aboriginal peoples, but to turn that gaze around upon themselves and to start to see the spaces from which they are speaking. So they have to look at a question like that, and they have to deconstruct the sociological space from whence it came. And so a fail paper is going to see the term mixed blood as a legitimate term. A good paper is going to be able to speak to eugenics, is going to be able to speak to blood quantum, is going to be able to reference assimilation policies. The very categorical word why, like it just is, so we want to know why it is. They have to unpack those assumptions. A good paper will articulate the omissions in the question, the assumptions in the question, the silences in the question. And we can see in that second question there issues of power imbalance which are intrinsic to understandings of cultural safety. It's all very well to tell students about power imbalances, but if they can't articulate how they are perpetuating those power imbalances themselves in a way that is artfully done, there's no use just... Uncle Tom said this phrase to me the first time he dropped me in it one day. It was a group of med students there. We were on the Coorong. And he said to me, he says, Brother Dave, he says, you can take this group. And like, I'm in the waders. I was the boat guy that day. I wasn't prepared to be talking to anyone. And he just said, I want you to talk to these guys. Give them a whitefellow perspective of what we do at Camp Coorong. I said, well, thanks for the heads up, Unc. So, this was in a bus as we were hiding out of the rain. And so I said what I said. And afterwards, we had a yarn as we were walking across the dunes. And he said, yeah, that was good, Dave. And I said, well, how'd you go? What do you think, Unc? He says, no, it was good. It was good. And I knew he had some reservations, And he said, well, Dave, you came to us as a political activist. That's why you're here. We love that. We like white fellas who actually start to realise this is about action and not just, aspirational comments. He said, but, Dave, there's no use slapping white fellas around the ears with their own ignorance. He says, I used to enjoy that. It used to be emotionally satisfying, and it was, but he says as an educative process, it's ineffective. And I was more than happy to do some slapping and get in people's faces about this kind of stuff, not realising that the eyes just glazed over. People had already left the conversation, even though they were still in the room. So this method of deconstructing, and I do apologise for the nature of these questions, but a question like that, why are all Aboriginal people lazy bums? If a good paper will start to get students to start to examine our shared histories, it is absolutely crucial that non-Indigenous Australians appreciate that there is not Aboriginal history that somehow ended at 1788 and then colonial history or Australian history that's a story thereafter. That we have to understand these shared histories, what was going on during these times of invasion, to even introduce the term invasion and use it as though it's a normal term amongst non-Indigenous students is a challenge. It creates a space of cognitive dissonance. They do not want to hear that term invasion. They're more than happy with the term settlement. So we have to unpack these words and why they're there. So students if they do their research, they do their readings, they start to realise that, we had slavery in Australia. We had indentured labour in Australia. This stolen generation as part of the 4 genocides was something that has impacted on Aboriginal peoples for the last 230 years. This isn't something that, that was all a long time ago and why can't they just get over it? Those kinds of phrases which have almost become a common understanding are things that we know we have to address, and I refer to Dennis's reference to transformative unlearning. If we don't start to get students to unlearn what they think they know, we're very unlikely to get very far with regards to getting them to address their own whiteness. As in my experience, white fellas usually just want to run screaming from the room when the term whiteness is mentioned or the term racism is mentioned. And so this method is a way, because it is an assessment piece, they have to do it. And that's the nub. It's all very well to have it as a tutorial activity. It's all very well to have it as a discussion piece, but if students are not assessed for it, they will not address it. Thank you. And so these are some of the tips that we give to students. They just want to answer the question. Okay, they'll tell you why certain things are the way they are if you allow them to enter into it in a shallow way. They have to not answer the question. It's a very difficult thing for many students to get past. They have to break down the question into words. They have to look at the implications, and I've talked already about trying to tease out the assumptions and trying to work out the stereotypes that are articulated in the question. So this is just an example. That's that question that this was in 2007, and unfortunately it still holds currency and relevance today, with the very brief breakdown there, and we're going to post these PowerPoints on the site for you so that you can have a look through them. So I won't go through all of the breakdown, but this is a student effort at deconstruction around that concept, that racialised concept. These breakdowns here have come from various staff around Flinders University that have thought, well, these are the sorts of things that I want to see students articulating when deconstructing a question like this. So what usually happens is that students come to an understanding through doing this exercise. They start to realise, you trot out a phrase like colonial discursive practice, and it's just going, it's just ricocheting off the whiteness and can't be heard, can't be owned. And so you actually have to get people to do something demonstrative. And students will then, by the end of doing this kind of exercise, and it is a formative paper, the paper that they do afterwards is actually critiquing Indigenous health policy. The reason that I introduced this exercise is because the master's students in public health were spectacularly unable to critique Indigenous health policy. We're trotting out racialised terms, we're trotting out stereotypes, we're speaking from a racialised position, and never even saw whiteness as coming into the conversation at all. And I thought, well, this just won't do. We have to do something to get these guys better equipped to be able to do the third assessment. And what I've discovered, and we've been doing this exercise now for a few years, is that students will come to you at the end of the semester, or they'll say to you in the evaluations, I've started to recognise myself and my family and all of the things that support the ways in which I thought I understood this country. I started to realise those things and realise the racism and the whiteness that I've been raised in, that I figured was just normal, that's just the way things are. And so students were able to start to address whiteness and racism within themselves, and they weren't being slapped around the ears with it, they weren't being confronted with it in such a way that there was immediate disengagement. Whilst pulling no punches, they were still able to address the very difficult questions and in a way that was inescapable and I think really does create transformative unlearning. Thank you.
We've got 4 minutes, I think, so I'll give you the 4-minute version. Dave laid it out beautifully. It's a way of, it's trying to find a way into that space, and we find by framing it cognitively and deconstructing the terminology gives people a way in, and the emotion will be there. It'll always be there. So if we're looking very briefly at what works in terms of individual transformation, what works in terms of organisational or institutional transformation, we picked up from our colleagues in the course of our OLT fellowship a number of things. And the first is from our colleague Barry Lavalle from University of Manitoba, past president of the Indigenous Physicians Association of Canada. And Barry talks about the process of self-reflection, that while it's actually important, he said, if your belly hurts, that's the process of self-reflection. It's not staying in your comfort zone. And I think some of our colleagues in Aotearoa are following us on the web today. And certainly that's a concept I've picked up there too. I've actually, from Dr. Rhys Jones, University of Auckland, says you can't reflect if you're staying inside your own knowledge bubble. You've got to get outside it and do that reflection. From the late Professor L.C. Chan, who introduced medical humanities at the University of Hong Kong and was a practicing Buddhist as well as an academic, would say, if there's dissonance there, don't turn away from it. Turn towards the dissonance. Turn towards the dissonance and find your way through it, which I think is just fabulous. It's just bloody hard to do. Bloody hard to do. But it's the starting point. So as we said today, if you can find those stereotypes, you don't have to find them, they find you. They're everywhere. I once put up a catalogue, those wordles that have all the 1 minute, there it is, here we go. You put up a wordle that says, which are the most important, or the biggest, most often repeated phrases here? And so all the stereotypes about Aboriginal people you ever saw in your life were up there, drunken and this and that, except there was Canada. There were Canadian stereotypes. They were exactly the same. So those stereotypes will come at you. It's the way you deconstruct them that is important. And I guess very close to the end here, one of the things we found helpful is this notion from Balgo, from the Western Desert. And it's the idea if you're growing up Aboriginal boys into men, that's a life challenge. It's a difficult time. And so the fellas there talk about kanyanimpa, and that's when you've got a massive change, you need to be held through that change. And so the men there would hold the boys emotionally and spiritually through that transformative part of their journey, and that's kanyanimpa. So we want to say there's a place for that. As Dave said, bringing Aboriginal knowledge back into the academy, there's a number of things we can use. Deep listening is another one, all sorts of things. Napaji, reciprocity, stewardship. But we think holding is a particularly apt one for the educational space. So I'll finish with one quote. I'd love if we had more time, I'd show you Melanie Turvlon, African-American paediatrician who gave the world the term cultural humility after the Rodney King riots, and a lot of work happening in Oakland, California. And Melanie said, if you want an organisation to change, you've got to find a way so it becomes embedded in that institution. It becomes part of the core business, not peripheral to the core business of that institution, and then change happens. I might leave it there, more questions later. Thank you.